Afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back. I moved to New York about 4 months ago, and I'm really happy to be back home. Actually, the Caribe Hilton is a very fitting place for this talk because when I started Rocket 11 years ago, our very first event took place at Caribe Hilton, so everything comes around. Lack of success, failure. Those are big words. Failure can be demoralizing. Failure can take you out entirely. And we've certainly had our share of failures along the way. But today, I'm going to tell you a story about how every time we had a failure, it was an opportunity to reinvent ourselves and emerge stronger to do more interesting things and have bolder ideas. I will share how we went from a business plan that I crafted in 2002 while at business school to a company that next year will do between $60 and $70 million in revenue, selling its services in 20 countries around the world. I'll tell you about the mistakes that we made and the things that we learned and the plans that we have for the future. So we all have our war stories. We all have the things that we've learned along the way. Some of those you can generalize from. Others are very idiosyncratic, very particular to your situation. In my case, if I had to summarize what I've learned over the past 10 years, is that in the end, it is all about people, passion, and innovation. All boils down to that. When it comes to innovation, it's not just product innovation. That's the obvious part. It's innovation in everything that you do. It's in how you finance your business, in how you set up your operations. Sometimes the most important innovations you can come up with have nothing to do with the product per se. People, when it comes to people, identifying the best people, motivating them, and just giving them space to operate is probably the most important thing that I do. And then passion. You know, some of us, and actually this was my case in particular, we think that discovering an entrepreneurial project is an intellectual exercise. It actually isn't. It's much more an emotional exercise. It's figuring out something that you really care for, having a solution that you're passionate about, and that you really want to take out to the world. That's the journey that we've had. When I think of entrepreneurship and leadership, this image comes to mind as a good reflection of what it is to be an entrepreneur. The first thing is, it's really not about you. If you look at this picture, the conductor is off to the side. The emphasis is in the orchestra. It's in the passion that they've had. It's in the amount of work that they've put into doing what they're doing right now. This guy is Gustavo Dudamel, a very famous Venezuelan orchestra leader. And to me, he symbolizes what it means to be a great leader. It's getting the people, taking a step to the side, letting them perform, letting them do their thing. So let's start. I'm very embarrassed to admit, I was a management consultant for 10 years. Not the most exciting thing in the world to do. In 1999, I was living in Argentina, and two things happened. Argentina collapsed between 2000 and 2001, and the firm that I worked with did an IPO. And basically, an IPO for someone that does consulting is robbing you of that holy grail that you've been working for 10 years, 100 hours a week. So my career was gone. With Argentina collapsing, my company was basically gone in Argentina, and my savings were gone as well. We had El Corralito, which basically meant you went to the bank and your money was not there. They told you it was going to be there eventually, but it was really not there. So I had no career, no money. I didn't know what to do. And at that point in time, I said, never again am I going to put my destiny in someone else's hands? I'm going to do something entrepreneurial. I don't know what it is right now, but I'm going to figure it out. How can I figure it out? I could go to a beach and reflect and see if some brilliant idea comes to mind, or I could go to a place where there's a lot of idea flow and deal flow and see if I can figure it out that way. So I decided to do that. In 2002, I decided to go back to business school with just one idea: find an industry to do something entrepreneurial. I went to every imaginable conference you can think of: biotech, software, alternative energy. I went to all the panels. I did all that thing. Very intense. Spent like 3 months spinning my wheels doing that. While I was doing that, I was participating in this program to provide tutoring services to low-income kids in East Palo Alto. East Palo Alto, Palo Alto are like 2 different continents. I was going there 2 days a week, tutoring kids in math and literacy, so in my case in math, and I was having the time of my life doing that. I was having the time of my life. I was getting a better understanding of why our education system in the US is so poor, and coming up with these small ideas on how to make it better in the lives of the students that I was tutoring. So I was doing that, and I was going through this big intellectual exercise. And when I realized that the problem that I was trying to solve with the left side of my brain, I really should be trying to solve with the right side of my brain, that's when I discovered that the answer was right in front of me. If I like education and I have a passion for this, and this is what really gets me going, I need to stop going to all these other conferences. I need to focus on this. And I had that epiphany late during the first semester of my first year of business school, and decided that I wanted to do something in education. Didn't know what at the time, but I wanted to do something in education. Why education? So when you look at this chart is actually a time machine. This is the world 30 years from now. The world 30 years from now is very Asia-centric. The US is not even in the radar screen. We're going to face very serious difficulties solely as a consequence of the very lousy education system that we have in place and the massive difference between it and what other countries are doing. Main problem here is lack of innovation. In everything that happens in education, at the heart of the problem, that's very significantly what needs to change. The world has changed in very significant ways, as we know, over the past 100 years. If someone from the 1800s were to come to the present day, they would be lost everywhere, with the exception of in a classroom. They would feel totally at home in a classroom. They would see that there's a teacher, that there's a blackboard, that the teacher is doing something and the students are trying to pay attention. That's the only thing in our society that has not changed at all. So society has changed in a very massive way. This thing has not changed. As an architectural matter, we look at that school and we are like, wow, it's awesome that that school is practically identical. But the fact that what happens inside of that school is practically identical should be very concerning to all of us, and that's the essence of what needs to be addressed. So now fast forward to the latter part of my first semester of business school. We had this project to develop a business plan for some entrepreneurial venture. As you can see, I did not have a naming consultant at the time, so I came up with this very creative name, Atoka. And basically, it was very fortuitous. As I was having this idea that I wanted to do something in education, the federal government passed this legislation that started a program that basically provided funding for low-income families to hire private companies to teach kids on an after-school basis what they were not learning during the regular school day. It was a program that was going to be rolled out throughout all of the US. It created overnight a $1 billion industry. Contrary to other parts of the world, the US has an education system that is 90% public and 10% private at the K-12 level, which means that when this industry was created, there was this enormous demand that needed to be satisfied and practically no supply in the system to provide that service. So at that point in time, I said, all right, this is the entry point. This is how I'm going to get into education. And basically, the way the program worked is every year, every state would need to administer a math and literacy exam to every student in every public school. They would calculate a weighted average for each school, and schools that fell below some number, the low-income kids in that school would be eligible for this program. Companies like ours would need to present a technical proposal at the state level, then get a contract at the district level, and finally, at the school level, we had to go through a selling process, selling our services to individual parents in a competitive setting, so other providers doing the same thing. The service then consisted of school would run from 8:30 to 2:30. At 3 o'clock, we would show up with our teachers, with our materials, with our software. We would give the kids a meal. We would provide them an academic service for 2 hours, and then we would transport them back to our houses. So in essence, that was the opportunity that I wanted to pursue. Turned out that Puerto Rico was the largest market in the US for the provision of this service because, unfortunately, we have many failing schools and many low-income kids. So I was living in California at the time, but it was very obvious that the logical place to start this was Puerto Rico. So in 2003, I decided, all right, when I start this, I'm going to come back home, get this thing done. And that's how the idea got started. Then we move on to the summer. And then the question became, okay, how do I get prepared for this? If I'm going to be doing this next year, what's the best way to get ready? I did some research and I identified other companies in the US that were pursuing a similar opportunity. There weren't that many of them, but there was one that was connected to one of my classmates. So I go to my classmate and I say, listen, man, you need to get me a job with these people. I want to go there. I want to work with them for the summer. I need to make this thing happen. Meanwhile, all of my classmates were going to all these training sessions on how to negotiate the best salary for the summer internship and how to maximize the amount of money that you're going to make in these 3 months. And I'm like, right, if this is so important and if I'm going to learn so much, I should be willing to pay them to hire me. I want to leave nothing up to chance. I'm going to call these guys and I'm going to tell them, this is who I am, this is what I've done, I want to work with you for the summer, and I'm going to charge you absolutely nothing. Make it really easy for them. So that's what I did. Spent the summer with them in New York, 3 months, understood the industry at a very low level of detail. How the service is provided, how the selling process works, what school districts are looking for, what parents pay attention to, the things that they were doing that worked, the things that they were doing that were not working. And with all those learnings, I came back to business school second year, and I was able to develop a refinement of my business plan that was much more reflective of reality than what I could have done sitting in a beach somewhere or getting a consulting internship somewhere. So that's what I did that summer. Fast forward to actually graduation. Graduate in May, come back to Puerto Rico. Now I need to raise money to get this thing done. And what do we know about raising money in Puerto Rico to start an entrepreneurial venture? It's very hard. It's often practically impossible. In this particular case, it was even harder because I had no experience operating absolutely anything. My only client was going to be the Puerto Rico Department of Education in a program that did not exist before. There was no case law. There was absolutely nothing. So raising money was very, very hard. And we had to get very creative. So we started by raising $200,000 from friends and family. That's definitely not an insignificant amount of money, and that was difficult to get, but that was the starting point. We developed a proof of concept. We did the service at a very small scale in a couple of schools. We went through the process. We proved that we could do this, invoice, collect, and that the thing was real. When we proved that the thing was real, we were able to go to a bank and say, we're going to be generating these receivables that are going to get paid with federal dollars, so they are valid collateral for a line of credit. Would you give us a line of credit to finance the provision of this service? And we were very lucky that Banco Popular was willing to make a bet on us, and that's how we got started. But that was insufficient. If all we had was the $200,000 and the line of credit, it would have been impossible to scale the business. With the line of credit, we were able to raise a small amount of equity financing, but that was still not sufficient. So that's when we had to get really creative. We knew that we were going to be hiring a very large amount of teachers to provide this service. So we said, okay, who could help us hire those teachers? And we started thinking about staffing agencies. So we identified the staffing agencies in Puerto Rico. We went to one of them and we said, listen, right now you're making 1% to 2% on your outstanding cash in bank balances right now. That's not very exciting. We want you to hire our teachers, and we want you to pay our teachers, and I'm going to pay you when I get paid. I'm going to give you a second lien on these receivables that are financing my line of credit right now, and I'm going to give you a very attractive interest rate to the tune of 10 to 15%. So very interesting rate for them, for us way cheaper than equity financing. And that's how we cracked the code of being able to scale the service without raising gigantic amounts of equity capital that would have diluted us into nothing. So innovation when it comes to financing can often be as important or more important than other sources of innovation. Next, we needed to figure out what were we actually going to do and how was it going to be different, both from what students were getting during the regular school day and different from what our competitors were doing. And the starting point had to be what is not working in the education system right now. And we focused on the few things that really mattered. Number one was, and we all lived this when we were in school, the educational materials are just not exciting. They're just boring, unexciting. It's easy to understand why school desertion is what it is based on the materials that are used in the classroom. On top of that, when you're talking about severely underperforming students, you could have a fourth grader that doesn't know how to read, but a book at the kinder level with themes at the kinder level would be childish for that fourth grader. Surprisingly, there weren't materials in the marketplace that had kinder grade reading level with fourth grade topics for that type of student. So the first thing that we did is we decided, all right, we're not going to buy curriculum materials from a third party. We're going to develop them ourselves. They're going to be project-based. They're going to be targeted at the needs of the students. And because they've been at school for 6 hours, we need to do something very different. We can't tell a student, you're going to stay here because you're failing math for 2 hours. We're going to tell a student, okay, you're going to stay here for 2 hours, and we're going to show you how to start your own business. Forget about the math. We're not even talking about the math when we're having the conversation with the student. The math happens in the background. So as we're teaching them what they need to learn to start a business, they are learning math. And we are equipping teachers with the paraphernalia to create a setting that is reminiscent of what a child would be doing if they were starting a lemonade stand or a car wash or whatever. So that's the first thing that we did that was very different from what was happening in the regular school day. Second one, and this is going to seem very obvious, but it's really not the case, is in the world of education, contrary to the world of medicine, to the world of engineering, to the world of finance, there's a huge disconnect between best practice and what's actually happening in the classroom. Teachers are, for the most part, thrown into a classroom with a lot of theoretical training, but not that much training on what really works in a real setting. So we hired a bunch of PhDs in education, put them on a plane, went around the world, see what was working in other countries, and codified y criollizamos to the Puerto Rican setting those methods for a Puerto Rican school so that they would be reflective of best practice. Another one that's very simple is teachers that are unequipped can't deliver a great service. And in the average public school, not only in Puerto Rico but in the US as well, the average teacher is buying materials with their money. So we decided that we were going to give teachers an average of $1,200 per teacher to tutor the 6 to 7 kids that they were going to be tutoring in our service. And that included all of the materials, the tablets, the software, the whole thing, so that they could provide the service. And in essence, nothing too revolutionary about that. Very simple things, blocking and tackling, but surprisingly very different from what happens in a typical school and very different from what our competitors were doing. Obviously, that had to evolve, and after a couple of years, product innovation became very important, and eventually we had a model that was all tablet-based. We had applications that we developed ourselves. All of them were connected to a project. We had music, we had video, we had books. We did the whole thing ourselves, everything connected to a project, very engaging for the students. That was pretty significant in terms of innovation, because even now, and this was 10 years ago, even now in the average school, the usage of information technology is very limited. And then we got started. We had the money, we had the product, we had figured out what we were going to do from a service perspective, we had a great plan, then we got started, and the plan did not survive the first encounter with reality. Everything started to go wrong. The product was not getting there in time, we had hired the wrong people, the transportation providers were taking kids to the wrong house. It was everything bad that could happen was happening. And it was a process of basically going through it, working out everything, being very patient. And something that I learned in that process is that more than intelligence, more than capital, more than anything else, emotional endurance is what matters the most when you're starting any business. Because it's going to fail. It's going to look like it's impossible. It's going to look like you should stop. And if you don't have that emotional endurance, it's just not going to work. Just not going to work. So if there's one thing that I've developed along the way, because I didn't have it when I started, it's that emotional endurance. And perhaps even more importantly, sometimes we think that success is the absence of problems. We went through school, we got good grades, we did well, our lives were not that problematic, we felt successful. And you think that success is the absence of problems. If you go into an entrepreneurial situation with that mindset, it's going to destroy you. Success, you need to reframe it. It's not the absence of problems, it is how do you recover from the problem. So expect the problem. Expect that you're going to feel like everything is falling apart. Success is overcoming that. We went from doing $2 million of revenue in our second year to doing $18 million of revenue in our third year and operating in 4 states. So the thing grew very, very quickly, and it was not artesanal very quickly. And then the question becomes, all right, how do I scale this thing up? And how do I deliver a service that's consistent and predictable? The secret sauce is generally the same. In our case, we had some differences. So generally, in a service business, it comes down to figuring out what are the key processes, training people on those processes, identifying the few variables that really matter, measuring them very quickly, and then having a feedback loop that allows you to understand when something needs to change, both in the short term and structurally. In our case, what did that mean? So, big difference between serving 2,000 students and serving 20,000 students. At the 20,000 student level, we needed to have fingerprint scanners in every school so that every day we knew exactly who showed up and who did not show up. That allowed us to calculate retention, allowed us to calculate student-teacher ratios, allowed us to understand every day how profitable sessions were being, figure out what parents needed to be called because their kids had not showed up the same day, and what teachers may need to get regrouped with other groups because their groups are too small. So getting that information every day, feeding it back to a data center, and reacting very quickly became very important for us. Obviously, when you start getting all of that information, you start discovering that there are things in your processes that don't work, that need to change structurally. Sometimes you can't implement that change right away. You need to wait for another cycle. Sometimes you're forced to do it right away because when you're doing something 20,000 times every day, even if you're operating at 99.9% effectiveness, every day, 20 things that should not happen are going to happen. And when you're dealing with kids, that's everything. That is, someone took a stapler and broke it on someone's head. That is a bunch of things. So having that feedback loop to react very quickly becomes very important. Now, this particular industry was very challenging because the way the law was structured, this was an imposition from the federal government to school districts around the US. So you're a school district, and right now, it's 2003, no one really knows whether you're doing well or not so well, and that feels kind of comfortable. Now, there's this new law that's going to shine a bright light on what's working and what's not working, and when it's not working, we're going to bring these outsiders to do in the afternoon what you were supposed to do during the regular school day. They're not loving that. They're not loving that. And when you have your client, your contracting party, in a constant low-grade warfare with you, that can get very uncomfortable very quickly, and that was the reality that we faced every day. Every day. Rules that changed, things that didn't make sense, gotcha compliance processes, and again, that can be very emotionally taxing. You just have to go through it. In our case, our secret sauce for dealing with that was A, developing a very strong relationship with the Federal Department of Education so that when things were done that were really out of bounds, we could go to them. And B, having a paper trail for everything that was happening to shine a bright light on things that were just fundamentally not making sense. That was 2004, 2005. To make a long story short, in a very short amount of time, we started doing between 20 and 35,000 students per year. We were providing the service in 16 states. We had become the largest company in the US providing the service. And as far as I know, I think that we became the first Puerto Rican business that led its industry on a national basis in the US by 2009. And that felt pretty good. So things were going well. We actually thrived in an industry where way more resourced competitors died very quick deaths. So imagine these guys from Puerto Rico who had a hard time getting any financing, competing with these guys, with Kaplan, with Princeton Review, with Edison, and kicking their ass every day. So life was good. You know, the other thing that, and actually the thing that I'm most proud of, is aside from all the success that we had financially and growth and all that stuff, is what we were actually achieving in the classroom. we commissioned NYU to do a study and basically, is this working? And if it's working, to what extent? Tell us, we want to know. NYU came in, they measured for several thousand students how they were learning versus a control group that was not receiving our services, and they came to a conclusion that in these very low performing schools, our students were performing at a way faster growth rate than students that were not getting the service. You know, that seems almost magical in some way, but you know, some of these schools, and I'm not talking only about Puerto Rico, I'm talking about Philadelphia, I'm talking about Chicago, I'm talking about LA. Some of these schools are places where education is just fundamentally not happening. Just not happening. So very simply, by going from groups of 30 to groups of 7, we get to select what teachers, we get to pay them based on performance, we give them resources that they didn't have before. Those simple things allowed us to generate results that far exceeded what others were doing. So life was good. And then 2009. 2009, someone wins the presidency. I voted for him. I really like him. Don't like his federal secretary of education that much. That's another story. New administration was not a fan of this program. 2009, started to read the tea leaves, and it was very obvious that some folks in Washington thought that private companies should not be doing what the public system should be doing. It was not evident right away, but it took less than a few months to discover that the movie was not going to end well. So here we were, we had this great company, we had been very successful, we were operating in 16 states, we had a few hundred employees, we were feeling great, and we knew that we were going to die. We were going to die. And I had this obsession of, how do I save the people that are working for us right now? How do we start a new business that becomes like a Noah's Ark that can bring these people to do something different? And spent a lot of time trying to think about that without any great results. And then we said, okay, we're going to die very soon if we don't do something very dramatic. Let's look at the landscape and try and figure out what's going to work and how we can start moving in that direction very quickly. By 2009, it was very obvious that the promise of education is going to change the classroom was starting to get real traction in the real world. And we knew that there was going to be an opportunity there because the level of change that would prompt would be so gigantic that there would be things for private companies to do both in the US and around the world. And we said, all right, this is our thesis. How can we exploit it? And then, you know, I had this thought of, we really aren't a company. We really aren't the 350 people that we were employing at the time. We really are a set of capabilities. That's what we are. We have shown that we can execute. We have sales and distribution in school districts throughout the US. We know how to operate at scale. We know how to provide a service to 40,000 people every day, feed them, transport them, give them an academic service. And we had this library of academic content that we had built over time. So the question became, okay, how do we redeploy these capabilities into other spaces? And we went through a process. We identified a bunch of things that we could do, going from preschools, educational software, educational consulting, a bunch of things, and we evaluated each one based on these criteria. So, are the unit economics good? Are they a good fit for our capabilities? Is it low capex? And you can read what's there. We went through that whole process and we identified a few things that were interesting, but then we had this other realization, and you're going to have to forgive me, but I'm going to get a bit nerdy for a moment. So, focus is most of the time, focus is indispensable. Sometimes focus is very dangerous. And that was the case in our case. So 500 million years ago, we had this thing called the Cambrian Explosion. The Cambrian Explosion is when the vast majority of organisms that exist today were invented by nature. The rate of change biologically was a couple of orders of magnitude what it had been in the past. A lot of organisms were invented, but most died. Things like eyes, ears, other organs were invented in multiple organisms. And those systems that were invented in multiple organisms mated because they were diversified and they were able to survive the change and they mated, right? So think about that analogy for a moment and now think about education. So what's happening in education right now is almost identical. Never has there been so much change in education. Never have so many educational companies around the world being funded. So much change, so much diversity, all these things happening at the same time. It's very foreseeable and it's beginning to, I'm beginning to see it. Most of these things are not going to make it. They're going to die. The vast majority. Something in the order of 99% of these new businesses that are starting right now in education, they're not going to make it. But the few that make it, something very exciting is going to be awaiting them. So the question becomes, how do you increase your probability of being one of the few that make it? And in our case, the answer was we needed to actually diversify. We needed to have a set of modular capabilities. Think of the eye, think of the ear. A set of modular capabilities that we could deploy in different spaces so that no matter what happened, we had a good chance of emerging on the other side. Along the way, these capabilities were going to get road tested in various places, so we're going to be learning. And what we learned in one place, we could apply to another place. So in our case, that meant that we chose to focus on these three businesses: teacher training, private schools, education technology. These are businesses that we have started in the past 3 years. Very quickly, teacher training, both in Puerto Rico and in the same 16 states where we operate. This is going to schools and training their teachers on leading-edge pedagogical methods, particularly the implementation of technology in the classroom. We use our same sales force, our same distribution capabilities, the same relationships that we've had in our other businesses. A lot of the same teacher training content that we had to develop for our first business, we were able to repackage for this business. So this was a very logical extension for us. That business is doing very well right now. It'll do sales of $20 to $25 million next year, and it's going to grow very quickly, particularly in terms of implementing technology in the classroom. Schools, and this is particularly preschools. So the U.S. has a world-class university system. It has a very mediocre K-12 system. It has a terrible preschool system. So it was very obvious to us that this very fragmented industry was a great opportunity, and particularly places that had significant supply-demand imbalances in the U.S. So we developed this database to compare population data from the census with the amount of supply in different places, and we identified the micro markets that needed preschools that they didn't have right now. But in that industry, the biggest mistake that you can make in private schools, you can have an amazing school, but if it's not in the right place, you're going to fail. So the way we mitigated that risk is we chose to grow through acquisition. So every school that we have right now, and we have schools in Florida, in Chicago, and in New York, is schools that we've acquired along the way from smaller competitors, and we're consolidating them. Eventually, there's going to be a common brand, there's going to be a common curriculum, and we're going to start exporting to other countries the secret sauce that we're building in the U.S. And finally, education technology. And I'm going to be spending a little bit more time talking about that one in particular, but that is selling math and science software both to school districts and to families to accelerate the learning process, particularly for high-achieving students. These businesses are also interesting because they are very complementary. So the software that I'm developing in my last business, I can use in my school's business. The teacher training resources that I'm building, I can bring to bear in my schools. I can use my schools to showcase the type of capabilities that I'm trying to sell in my services business. So these things fit together in interesting ways, and they were the answer to how do we go from the dinosaur that's about to die to becoming something that can thrive going forward. Let me spend a few minutes talking about the software opportunity in particular. How do we start with that one? So the first thing that we did is we looked at the landscape to understand the companies that were playing, particularly in the US, the ones that were doing well and the ones that were not doing so well. And we grouped them into three categories. We had the dreamers, which were the guys that had a great idea, but nothing else. And there's a gigantic number of those. The legacy players, so those were the traditional curriculum providers. They were basically just digitizing the same thing that they've been doing for 100 years. Nothing exciting about that, but they have distribution capabilities and they have a brand. And then what I call the threshold players, which are the well-financed companies that actually have an idea and a business model that is working. And the question for us was, okay, how do we compete in that space? How do we bring to bear the capabilities that we have right now and supplement them with things that we don't have? And this was our answer to that. We went to Stanford University and we negotiated a deal in which we bought all of their K-8 digital curriculum assets that they had been developing for the past 20 years. They had a focus on digital curriculum products for high-achieving students. So if you look at the market right now, there are many things for students that have difficulties. There are many things for the average students. There's practically nothing for high-achieving students. So we thought, if we could get that, and we could get the Stanford brand, and we could get a research collaboration with Stanford for the next 10 years, build things with them and brand it with their brand, that could be very powerful. So that was the starting point. We then said, okay, this business that's dying, what can we get from that business and redeploy it to this opportunity? And those were the salespeople, the distribution capabilities, and the operational capabilities to sell into school districts. We also identified that there was a consumer play, so not selling to school districts, but actually selling to parents, particularly in places like Asia, where they have these tiger parents that want to ensure that their kids have the best of everything. But selling into the consumer was not a capability that we had, so it was obvious that we had to acquire that in some way. And at a very high level, this is the team that we built, very modular. So some people that we brought from our legacy business, some people that we bought from Stanford, and some people that we poached from our competitors. And here, I say the model is Hollywood, not Wall Street, and what I mean by that is people need to feel comfortable with the fact that there are teams that are going to make sense for a short amount of time. They're going to come together, they're going to be very productive, and then they need to be redeployed to do different things. And if people are comfortable with that, there are many interesting opportunities within a company to redeploy resources. And this was our answer to that. World-class product. So, we said, okay, this time we really want to build something that can aspire to being on the cover of Time one day. We're going to, as a starting point, we're going to take what we got from Stanford. We're going to invest a very significant amount of money to make it better, and we're going to swing for the fences. And this is what we're building right now. It's going to be ready in February. It's going to be math for K-8 students. We're going to be doing science subsequently. and it's going to be all project-based learning and games. So think of the traditional education model is there is fixed time and variable learning, meaning you go through grades and you learn whatever you learned as you're going through the grades. The timing is fixed, as opposed to fixed learning and variable timing, meaning you progress through the curriculum at your pace, which could be way faster or slower than the typical pace, but you're learning absolutely everything that you need to learn in a highly individualized manner, in this particular case, through games and through projects. So the theme here is projects that are reminiscent of what scientists and engineers do in the real world. So we're going to have third graders, in a very simple way, programming self-driving cars. We're going to have fifth graders designing satellites. We're going to have seventh graders simulating pizza operations to figure out how many pizza preparers they need to hire and how many ovens they need to have. And in the background, they're going to be learning math. It's going to be really cool. Very excited about this. So this is product innovation. Consumer marketing, and I know I'm running out of time. Consumer marketing is something that we had never done before and that we had to get acquainted with very quickly. So those are capabilities that we hired from the outside world. We're doing the things that you can imagine: Google ads, Facebook ads, LinkedIn. We're doing identifying convening points off-site of parents that are likely to have high-achieving students. We're doing all those things. The idea here is experimenting at a very small scale and then scaling the things that matter very quickly. And then operations, the good thing about operations is that contrary to the situation when we started in 2004, that we had to build everything from scratch. The vast majority of the operational capabilities that we're using in this business are things that we've bought from third parties and that we've been able to integrate very quickly, very effectively, with a technology team that is way smaller than what it would have been 10 years ago. So the good news there is that the threshold to get started and to deliver something that's really world quality has gone down very significantly. So a company like us can compete with the really big players and have similar capabilities based on tools like this one. And, as I said, not to be boastful or anything like that, but we have big dreams. We really want this product to become the benchmark of math and science education around the world. We're starting in the US and Asia. We're building a great product. A year from now, we're going to start building the product for science as well, building distribution in Europe and Latin America. And 4 years from now, we aspire to be selling this product around the world, and we hope that it really becomes the best math and science product out there. We're optimistic that we can get it done, but it's very important for me to ensure that my team understands that that's what we are aspiring to. That's the plan. It may not work. And if it does not work, we're going to figure it out, just like we did with our other business. There's one thing that I've learned. I'll end with how I started. It's all about passion, people, and innovation. This thing does not work. We're going to go back, get the best people we can get, identify a problem that needs a solution, innovate, and make it happen. And hopefully ensure that we have the emotional endurance to overcome the many problems that will arise along the way. Thank you very much. Thank you.